The Velkari were not a warrior species. They had never needed to be. For thousands of years, their world had been a quiet one, full of open fields, long rivers, and cities that glowed soft blue at night from the light their own bodies gave off. They built libraries instead of barracks. They trained doctors instead of soldiers. War, to them, was something that happened in old stories, not in real life. But real life had other plans. 3 weeks ago, the Croft Dominion's fleet appeared at the edge of their solar system. No warning. No greeting. Just ships, hundreds of them, sitting still and dark against the stars like a wall of iron. The Velkari sent peaceful messages. The Croft didn't reply. They just waited the way a storm waits before it hits. Elder Velocis understood what that silence meant. He had read enough history to know that when an empire like the Croft stopped talking, it was because talking was already over. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to take. The council met through the night. Some wanted to surrender early, hoping for mercy. Others wanted to resist, even though their entire defense force was a small collection of old patrol ships that couldn't survive a single real firefight. A few council members just sat quietly because they didn't know what to say. By the time the first light of morning came through the council hall windows, Elder Velocis had made a decision. They would call for help. Not from anyone specific. They didn't have powerful allies or old friendships with military civilizations. They simply opened a wide broadcast channel and sent a distress signal out into the galaxy. A plain, honest message that said who they were, where they were, and what was about to happen to them. The signal traveled outward at the speed of light, reaching comm stations and relay points across known space, landing in the inboxes of over 200 different civilizations. Most of them didn't respond at all. A few sent automated replies saying the message had been received and would be reviewed. One civilization sent back a polite note explaining that they had a policy of non-interference in conflicts outside their territory. Another said they were sorry but they were too far away to help in time. The hours passed. The Croft fleet stayed where it was, still not moving, still not speaking. Like they were enjoying the wait. Then, for hours after the signal went out, something came back. It wasn't a long message. It wasn't full of promises or political language. It was short, direct, and it came from a species that most of the galaxy knew only by their registry classification. Homo sapiens. Planet of origin, Earth. Threat classification, Deathworld, Class 9. The message said, SOS received. Fleet is moving. Hold your people together. It was signed by a Captain James Cole. Elder Velocis read it twice. His assistant, a young Velkari named Tilven, looked over his shoulder and asked what a Deathworld Class 9 meant. Velocis pulled up the registry file on his screen. Class 9 was the second highest threat rating the Galactic Registry gave to a planet, reserved for worlds so hostile, so dangerous, so full of things that could kill you, that most species wouldn't survive on the surface for more than a few hours. High gravity. Extreme weather. Predators at every level of the food chain. Diseases that mutated fast. Environments that changed without warning. Earth had all of that. And somehow, instead of dying out, the species that evolved there had learned to handle it. Not just handle it, thrive in it. Tilven was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the obvious question. Are they sending help or are they another threat? Velocis didn't have a clean answer. He honestly didn't know. He had never dealt with humans before. Nobody on the council had. They were a relatively young species in galactic terms, not widely known, not part of any of the major political alliances. They mostly kept to themselves. But they had responded when no one else did. And the message hadn't been careful or diplomatic or full of conditions. It was simple. Almost casual. Like helping was just something they did without needing to think too hard about it. Velocis sent back a confirmation and told his people to stay calm. He stood at the window of the council hall and looked up at the sky, where somewhere beyond what his eyes could see, the Croft fleet was still waiting. And somewhere further out, something else was moving toward them. He chose to hope it was the second thing that arrived first. The waiting was the hardest part. Elder Velocis had told his people to stay calm, but staying calm is a lot easier to say than to do when there's an Empire fleet sitting at the edge of your solar system and the only thing standing between you and them is a message from a species you've never met. The Velkari went about their days quietly, speaking in low voices, watching the sky more than usual. Children stayed close to their parents. The markets were still open but half empty. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, and nobody knew which thing would happen first. Ambassador Velocis spent most of that time in the communication center, going through every piece of information the registry had on humans. She wanted to know who was coming. She wanted to understand them before they arrived, because walking into a room blind had never been a strategy that worked out well for anyone. The file on Earth was not comforting at first glance. The planet itself was described as marginally habitable for most known species. The atmosphere had oxygen levels that sat right at the edge of being breathable, mixed with other gases that would cause problems over time. The surface temperature swung between extremes depending on location and season. Large portions of the planet were covered in deep ocean that reached pressures capable of crushing most standard spacecraft hulls. The land masses had environments ranging from frozen wasteland to burning desert, sometimes within the same continent. The gravity was nearly double what most species considered comfortable for daily life. And the wildlife. The registry had an entire subsection on Earth's wildlife. Creatures with enough physical strength to tear through metal plating. Microscopic organisms that could breach most standard biological filters. Insects. Velasquez lingered on the section about insects for longer than she expected to. But the part that really caught her attention wasn't the planet. It was the history of the people who came from it. Humans had spent the majority of their existence at war with each other. Not small disagreements. Not border skirmishes. Full, total wars that pulled entire continents into the fighting. They had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their own planet and had come terrifyingly close to using them more than once. They had disease outbreaks that killed hundreds of millions. They had economic collapses. Environmental damage that should have broken them beyond recovery. And every single time they came back, they rebuilt. They adapted. They kept going. The registry's analysis section had one line that Velasquez read 3 times. Species demonstrates unusual psychological resilience under extreme duress. Threat response appears to increase rather than decrease under pressure. She was still thinking about that line when the alert came through. 31 ships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the outer edge of the system. Velasquez pulled up the visual feed and leaned forward in her chair. She had been expecting something. Ships, yes, obviously ships. But there was a difference between knowing something intellectually and seeing it with your own eyes. These were not transport vessels. They were not the kind of ships you sent when you wanted to deliver aid packages and medical supplies. They were long and dark and dense, built with the kind of heavy layered hull plating that said very clearly that whoever designed them expected to take hits and keep moving. The weapons arrays mounted along the sides were large enough that her translation system flagged several of them as unknown classifications, which meant they didn't match anything already in the galactic database. There were no relief ships in the formation. No science vessels. No diplomatic cruisers with their standard white paneling and soft running lights. Just 31 warships sitting in clean formation, engines cooling down from the jump, waiting. A channel opened. The voice that came through was a woman's, steady, unhurried, the kind of tone that didn't go up at the end of sentences because it didn't need to ask permission for anything. Ambassador, this is Commander Kate Morrison, United Earth Navy. We have your coordinates and we've reviewed the situation. Tell us where you need us. Velasquez took one breath and straightened in her seat. She had prepared a formal greeting. A proper diplomatic opening with the traditional Velkari phrases of welcome and gratitude. She had practiced it twice that morning. She forgot all of it. The Kroth fleet is holding position at the northern edge of the system, she said. They haven't moved yet, but we believe they're waiting for a final order to advance. Understood, Morrison said. There was a brief pause, not hesitation, more like someone checking a screen. We're moving into position now. Keep your people away from the northern orbital lanes. The channel closed. Velasquez sat back and looked at the feed again. The 31 ships were already moving, slow and deliberate, like they had done this before and knew exactly how it went. She believed them. Kroth Admiral Doric had done this 14 times. 14 systems. 14 civilizations that looked up at the sky one day and saw his fleet and understood immediately that the math didn't work in their favor. Some of them cried. Some of them argued. A few tried to fight back with whatever small defense forces they had, and those were the ones Doric almost respected, even as he crushed them. But all of them eventually did the same thing. They listened to his terms. They accepted. They submitted. It was never really a battle. It was just pressure. You showed up with enough force and the other side did the only logical thing. That was how power worked. That was how the Kroth Dominion had grown from 1 system to 9, and soon to 10. He broadcast the standard terms with the same tone he always used. Flat. Official. The voice of someone reading from a document because the outcome was already decided. Surrender your defense forces. Disarm all orbital platforms. Open your communication channels to Kroth administration. Resistance would be met with overwhelming response. Compliance would be met with order. He didn't expect a reply for at least 20 minutes. That's usually how long it took for the panic to settle and the logic to kick in. They'd look at their own forces, look at his, and start doing the math. What he got instead came in less than 30 seconds. A voice cut across the open channel. Human. Mel. And the thing that threw Doric off more than anything else wasn't what the voice said, it was how it said it. There was no tension in it. No urgency. It was the voice of someone who had sat down at a table to have a conversation they had already finished in their head. This is Admiral Roy Harding, United Earth Navy. You are currently in a protected system. I'm giving you 17 minutes to reverse course and withdraw your fleet. That clock starts now. Doric stared at the comm panel for a moment. His second in command, standing 2 steps to his right, made a sound that was the Kroth equivalent of a laugh. Then a few of the officers at their stations joined in. 17 minutes. One human admiral with some small collection of ships had just told the Kroth Dominion fleet, 300 guns, warships that had cracked orbital platforms across 9 systems, that they had 17 minutes to leave. Doric let them laugh. He almost laughed himself. He pulled up the visual scan of the human fleet and looked at the numbers. 31 ships. Reasonable size, he admitted. Decent hull plating from what the sensors were showing. But 31 against his formation was not a fight. It was a gesture. He didn't bother responding to Harding. There was nothing to say. The 17 minutes would pass, nothing would happen, and then Doric would advance on the planet and the humans would make a choice. Fall back and survive or get swept up in the same operation as the Velkari. Either way, it wasn't his problem. The minutes passed slowly. Doric watched the human ships on the display. They hadn't moved. They were holding formation in a tight line between his fleet and the inner system, which he found professionally interesting if nothing else. Clean positioning. Someone over there knew what they were doing, at least in terms of placement. At minute 12, one of his officers asked if they should prepare a response communication. Doric said no. At minute 15, he ordered the fleet to begin the slow advance. No need to wait for the deadline to pass. The humans had made their choice by staying, and now they would learn what that choice cost. At minute 17, the channel opened again. Roy Harding's voice came through exactly as it had the first time. Same pace. Same tone. Like the last 17 minutes had been a mild inconvenience rather than the edge of a battle. Time's up. Then, a half second later, quieter, clearly not meant as a broadcast but picked up on the open channel anyway, 2 words spoken to someone else in the room. All batteries. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not something Dorica's reports would describe accurately afterward, partly because accurate description would have required him to admit things he was not willing to put in writing. The humans didn't fight the way his fleet models predicted. They didn't hold a defensive line and absorb hits. They pushed forward, moved between his formations, forced his ships to adjust angles to avoid hitting each other, and fired with a kind of focused precision that turned his 300-gun advantage into something far messier than the number suggested. 11 minutes later, the Kroth formation was broken. Not defeated completely, but broken. Scattered. Ships peeling away in different directions trying to create distance. On the open channel, no one from the human fleet said a word. They didn't need to. The wreckage said it for them. Ambassador Vela SS had watched the entire battle from the communication center. She had watched it on 3 different screens at once. The tactical display showing ship positions, the sensor feed showing energy outputs, and a direct visual that one of the human ships had shared with her team as a courtesy. She had gripped the edge of her desk for most of those 11 minutes without realizing it. When the Kroth formation finally broke apart and the ships began scattering in different directions, she let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since the whole thing started. It was over. They had done it. 31 ships had walked into a fight with a fleet 3 times their size and come out the other side with the Kroth running. She wanted to feel relief, and she did, genuinely, but underneath it was something else. A kind of stunned quiet that comes when reality turns out completely different from every version of it you had prepared yourself for. She turned to her assistant and said they needed to begin preparing a formal message of gratitude to the human fleet. Standard diplomatic protocol after a military intervention was to open negotiations, discuss next steps, arrange for the defending fleet to hold position while both sides assessed the situation. That was when she looked back at the tactical display. The human ships were moving. Not holding. Not repositioning into a defensive formation around the planet. Moving, accelerating, actually, in the direction the Kroth ships had fled. She watched the display for a few seconds thinking it might be a sensor error or a minor repositioning maneuver. But the trajectories were clear. The human fleet was pursuing the Kroth. Vela SS opened a channel to the nearest human ship immediately. Captain James Cole answered. He was younger than she had imagined from his voice, broad-shouldered, calm-faced, with the kind of expression that didn't change much regardless of what was happening around him. Behind him she could see the interior of a bridge, crew members moving efficiently between stations, nobody panicking, nobody celebrating. Just working. "Captain," Vasa said carefully, "your fleet appears to be in pursuit of the withdrawing Kroth ships." "Yes, ma'am," Cole said. She waited for more. There wasn't more. "The battle is over," she said. "The Kroth formation has broken. They are leaving the system." "They're leaving this system," Cole said. "That's not the same thing as being done." Velas opened her mouth and then closed it again. She looked at the display one more time, watching the human ships push further out, closing distance on the scattered Kroth vessels with steady, unhurried acceleration. "Why are they chasing them?" she asked, though she was half asking herself as much as him. Cole's answer came without any pause, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because if we let them run, they'll just come back with more ships. We've seen this before." The simplicity of it hit her harder than she expected. She had grown up in a civilization that believed, genuinely and deeply, that the end of a conflict was the moment the other side stopped fighting. You defended yourself, you pushed back hard enough that the aggressor reconsidered, and then both parties withdrew and eventually found their way to a table. That was how it worked. That was the civilized model. Most of the galaxy operated on some version of that understanding. But Cole had said something that cut straight through all of that with 4 words. "We've seen this before." Velasquez pulled up the human history file again, the one she had been reading while waiting for the fleet to arrive. She hadn't finished it. There was a lot of it, and a lot of it was difficult to read. Wars that lasted years. Conflicts that ended on paper and then quietly continued. Empires that retreated and rebuilt and came back stronger. Humanity had lived through that cycle more times than she could count on one hand, and they had learned something from it that most of the galaxy apparently hadn't. Letting a threat walk away intact wasn't peace. It was just a longer countdown to the same problem. She watched the display in silence for a long time after that. The human ships were well into the outer system now, still accelerating. The Kroth vessels were trying to increase their own speed, but the gap wasn't growing fast enough. A few of the smaller Kroth ships had already changed course entirely, scattering in different directions rather than staying in any kind of group. Commander Kate Morrison's voice came over the channel briefly to let Velasquez know that the planet was now clear and that a small group of 3 human ships would remain close to provide cover while the rest continued pursuit. 3 ships left behind to guard an entire world. The other 28 were still chasing. Velasquez sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She had called for help and something had answered. But she was only now beginning to understand the full shape of what that something actually was. 18 days after the battle, the Kroth Dominion did something they had never done in their entire history of expansion. They asked for a meeting. Not a negotiation from a position of strength. Not a demand dressed up in polite language. An actual, straightforward request for a formal session at the Galactic Assembly, the kind of request that, coming from the Kroth, stunned most of the other civilizations into silence when the news came through. Species that had watched the Kroth swallow system after system without so much as a diplomatic courtesy were now reading alerts about the Dominion requesting a peaceful boundary discussion. The word spread fast. Everyone wanted to know what had happened out there. The battle reports were already circulating through back channels. 31 human ships, a Kroth fleet 3 times that size, 11 minutes, outcome decisive. But the numbers alone didn't explain why an empire that had never once voluntarily stopped its expansion was now sitting in an assembly chamber asking for a line on a map they had to stay behind. Admiral Roy Harding represented humanity at the session. He arrived without a large delegation. Just himself, Commander Kate Morrison standing to his left, and a small legal team who carried documents and said very little. He wore his uniform without decoration beyond his rank insignia, which a few of the assembly observers noted privately was either a deliberate show of simplicity or just the way he always dressed. Either way, it made an impression. The Kroth envoy came with a full formal delegation and opened with a carefully worded proposal. They wanted a defined boundary, specific coordinates, mutually agreed upon, forming a line that both the Kroth Dominion and humanity would respect. They would stay on their side. They were asking the humans to commit to staying on theirs. Harding listened to the full proposal without interrupting. When the envoy finished, Harding was quiet for a moment, then he set a single document on the table and slid it forward. On it was a list. Every system the Kroth had occupied. Every world they had taken. Every civilization still living under Kroth administration that had been there before the Dominion arrived. He told the envoy that he was happy to discuss boundaries. But before any line got drawn on any map, every name on that list needed to be addressed. Every occupied world returned to its own governance. Every civilization that had submitted under pressure given back its freedom. The envoy started to explain the complexities of that request. The administrative structures involved. The economic dependencies. The time it would take. Harding nodded along, patient, and then said simply that he understood it was complicated and that humanity was willing to wait while the Croth worked through the complications. However long it took. He wasn't in a hurry. The session lasted 3 hours. When it ended, the Croth had agreed to a withdrawal timeline. Nobody in that chamber had ever seen the Croth agree to anything before. Back on Velkar, the days after the battle had a strange, fragile quality to them. The kind of quiet that follows something large and frightening, not fully peaceful yet but no longer bracing for impact. People came back to the markets. Children went back to their routines. The glow of the city at night looked the same as it always had, soft blue against the dark, like nothing had happened. Ambassador Veles went down to the docking platform on the 4th day after the assembly session, when the human ships had returned to the planet to resupply before making the long journey back to Earth. She watched the crew moving around the dock, carrying equipment, running checks, talking to each other in that easy, unhurried way humans seemed to have when they weren't in the middle of something urgent. They looked ordinary. That was the strange part. After everything, they just looked like people going about their work. She found Admiral Harding standing at the far end of the platform, looking out at the sky. He had a cup of something warm in his hand and he looked like a man who hadn't slept as much as he should have in the past few weeks but wasn't going to complain about it. Veles stood beside him for a moment before speaking. She had been carrying one question since the very first day, since the moment his fleet appeared on the sensors and she realized they had actually come. She had turned it over in her mind 100 times and never found a satisfying answer on her own. "Why did you come?" she asked. "We sent that signal to 200 civilizations. No one else responded. Why did you?" Harding looked out at the sky for a moment longer. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression that wasn't complicated at all. "You asked," he said. "That was enough." Veles didn't say anything after that. There wasn't anything to say. 3 weeks later, workers carved those 4 words above the main entrance of the Velkari Council Hall, deep into the stone where weather and time couldn't easily reach them. They are still there today.